I'm Noah Pickus, the director of the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2008 Kenan Distinguished Lectureship in Ethics. I have a couple thank yous that I want to mention right away. To the Kenan Fund and family, and especially to Betty Kenan, who is here with us tonight, we are especially grateful. I also want to list the co-sponsors. If you'll look in your program, you'll see that there are 16 in all from across the university, which I think is a testimony to both the importance of the subject and to our speaker tonight, and we're grateful to all of you for helping to make this possible. And I also want to thank the wonderful staff of the Kenan Institute for Ethics who have worked hard and long to make this successful. Fiona Terry has come all the way from the Sudan to be with us today, and as you might imagine, there are a few logistics involved in making that happen. The Kenan Institute is a think and do tank committed to addressing real-world problems and ethical challenges, both for individuals, organizations, and societies. And increasingly, as is happening across this university, our work includes a focus at the intersection of civic and global ethics. And it's in this emerging area that we're delighted to have Fiona Terry with us today. We're grateful to her for traveling all the way from the Sudan to be with us. Now, as you'll hear in a moment from Provost Lang, who will do the proper introduction, Dr. Terry brings a remarkable combination both of thinking and doing in her entire career. And we were interested in bringing her here to Duke at this time for two reasons. One is the obvious importance of the humanitarian issues that she is at the center of and works on in the world today. And the other is that as Duke becomes increasingly globally engaged in so many different ways, from campuses abroad to Duke Engage, we thought it was a good time to have someone who is living and doing, writing and thinking and being this kind of engaged person come and help us to think through what it means to do good, but also what it means to assess where you're doing good and where you might actually do harm. Now, Dr. Terry has been with us already for a few days, and she's met with several undergraduate, graduate students, and faculty groups associated with Kenan. She's meeting tomorrow with faculty and students with the Duke Global Health Institute, with faculty at Duke and at UNC who are interested in the intersection of refugees, governance, ethics, and health issues. And she's also meeting tomorrow with 20 returning Duke Engage students, and then if we haven't worn her out by then, she'll complete with the dinner of graduate fellows who are working in the issues of human rights. So we very much appreciate your willingness, Fiona, to be with us tonight, and we're delighted that we can honor you and that we can learn from you here. And I wanted to invite Provost Peter Lang to provide you with the proper and formal introduction. Welcome.
Thank you, Noah. As all of you will soon note, we have multiple opportunities to say much the same thing. So I do want to first thank the Kenan Fund and family for their support for this lectureship and for the Kenan Institute, and Betty, we of course thank you always. In Mr. Duke's original indenture to the university, he underlined service to the broader community as an essential part of the mission of Duke University. At that time, well less than a century ago, we were a small North Carolina university with large ambitions. Today, we are something quite different, an increasingly international university with outrageous ambitions, to borrow from Terry Sanford's characterization. But I think it's important always to remember that our commitment to service has certainly not diminished, but instead grown, and grown enormously in recent years. As many of you are aware, in our current strategic plan, Making a Difference, putting our knowledge at the service of society is one of the central priorities that we are carrying forward across the university. And combining that commitment to taking the knowledge which we develop in the university and taking it out to the society, and also understanding that the knowledge which we develop in the university is enhanced by its engagement with the society. So we bring back to the university as well as simply projecting out our knowledge. When we combine that commitment to civic engagement with our commitment as well to internationalization and to interdisciplinary work, we find ourselves making a powerful brew to meet the profound needs that we find in the world. Because as we all recognize, it is in some ways the combination of that commitment to service, the ability to bring multiple disciplines to bear on the ways that we deliver that service, and our ability to do so for the problems of the world and not just the problems in your home, although those also count, that we build that powerful brew. And of course, there are direct manifestations of that at Duke in the last few years, the development of the Duke Global Health Institute being one, and the development of Duke Engage being another. But with a projection into the world must come an understanding of that world. With service must come responsibility. With the will and heart to do good must come the intelligence and understanding of the possibility of doing harm. So as we expand and enhance the role of the university to meet the demands of our times and our century, we must not fail to heed the need to educate our minds and inform our engagements with the responsibility to understand both the ability to do good and the ability that even though we are seeking to do good, we may in fact do harm. In that context, our speaker today could not be better selected. Let me just say a few things about Fiona Terry. She has spent most of the past 15 years involved in humanitarian relief operations in different parts of the world, including, and you know, when I run through this list, you're going to be sort of like, how could anybody have been in all of these places engaging these kinds of humanitarian relief efforts? Northern Iraq, Somalia, the Great Lakes region of Africa, Liberia, and along the Sino-Korean border. And were that not enough, from 2000 to 2003, she worked as a research director with Médecins Sans Frontières in Paris, then spent 3 years in Myanmar with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and is currently, as Noah noted, serving time, that's probably not the right expression, although undertaking service as an independent researcher in the Sudan. Dr. Terry holds a PhD in international relations and political science from the Australian National University and is the author of Condemned to Repeat, The Paradox of Humanitarian Action. Her book won the 2006 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, and it will be the inspiration I expect for much that she will say today. So Fiona, welcome, and please come forward. If you'd like, I can have them.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter and Noah. Well, I'm very, very honoured to be here tonight and to be let go out of released, what was the word you used, from the Sudan and come to very much greener pastures here in North Carolina. It's a real treat for me. I've not done much public speaking over the last couple of years, and you know, it's 6 years since my book was published, and it's really gratifying to see that today people are still really interested in these issues, and I'm very pleased because these issues are central to my work and to the work of so many humanitarian actors. But unfortunately, not enough people, I think, pay heed to some of the messages I was trying to get through about the negative consequences of humanitarian action. So what I'd like to do today is just briefly perhaps talk about some of these paradoxes of humanitarian action before turning to some of the ethical issues they raise, and then perhaps give some thoughts on some of the things we need to be aware of, and before taking questions. And I would like just to add a few little thanks, especially to people from the Kenan Institute, to Amy and Doris in particular, because it's been really fantastically organised, and to the students that I've met over the last 2 days. And I have to say, wow, what an amazing group of students. And it really gives me you know, real inspiration for the future. If this is the people that are coming up with the questions and issues they're raising and the knowledge they already have as first-year students, second-year students, this is amazing. So that's really great. So the paradox of humanitarian action. Well, humanitarian action, since its inception, was imbued with an inherent paradox that in alleviating suffering, we can inadvertently prolong the suffering. And it's in the very notion and very fundamentals of the modern humanitarian act with the birth of the Red Cross in 1863. And the idea that by going into a conflict and rescuing the wounded combatants from the battlefield, taking them back to a health centre and patching them up, nowhere in international law did it ever say that those people must remain outside conflict. So, of course, they can then rejoin the conflict and thereby potentially prolong the conflict. And we see a very modern manifestation of this very exact dilemma today in Sudan, where the Red Cross is reacting to calls by the rebels that they have wounded combatants, flying in with a mobile surgical team, operating on these combatants under a tree, and flying out again. And there is no law to say that these combatants must not return to fighting. But even though it is imbued with this paradox, the belief is that it is more important to save a human life. We cannot necessarily be responsible for the consequences down the road. We have no control over them as to whether these fighters will go back to fight or will remain outside the conflict. So this is sort of the one fundamental paradox, and then this leads on to many others. And I would like to talk about a situation that happened in 1994 until 1996. It might seem like a long time ago, but the Rwandan refugee camps in Zaire and Tanzania were such a great example of the coming together of all these paradoxes that sometimes it takes an extreme example to really be able to focus in on what happened and the dilemmas that were posed to humanitarian actors. So if you all recall, during the genocide, which was going on, the Rwandan Patriotic Front that was based in Uganda swept into the country, and the people responsible for the genocide were pretty quickly defeated and were pushed to the outsides of the country, first to Tanzania and then into Zaire, which today is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these people managed to use the humanitarian camps as a source of control over the populations. They gained protection for at least 2 years before the camps were attacked by hiding in amongst the refugees. They were able to get control of the aid distribution systems by putting their representatives in charge of the distribution lists, in charge of the distribution, the way it was carried out. They gained legitimacy as being accepted by the aid community as the legitimate representatives of the refugees. And of course, they were able to divert a lot of this aid, inflate population numbers so that they, received a lot of money from the international community. Just to give an example of that, every local worker in the camps was taxed at a rate of 20% of their salary. And when you multiply the sort of average salary by the number of workers, it ended up being millions of dollars a month going into the hands of people who had perpetrated genocide. So what do we do in a situation like that? Do we abandon the refugees, saying this is unacceptable? What is the responsibility of the aid organisations for the consequences of what happened in the camps? Because you may remember in 1996, the Rwandan government attacked the camps, and it pushed a lot of the refugees back into Rwanda. But those that were too afraid or did not want to go back to Rwanda were chased into Zaire. And there, many of them were massacred, and nobody knows today how many died, but there are estimations up to 200,000 people that were never accounted for that had been registered in the camps. So this was a major consequence of the Rwandan refugee camps. And nobody could say that this consequence was unpredictable, because we only needed to look towards the Khmer Rouge and the way they used the camps in Thailand or on the Thai-Cambodian border over many years, and were able to rebuild their fighting force and create a lot of problems for the Cambodian population. So, so the question then remains, what is the responsibility of the aid organisations who were working in the camps? Of course, aid organisations don't have the power to disarm the people responsible for genocide. Aid organisations made many calls to the international, this lovely nebulous term, the international community, to do something to come and separate the legitimate refugees from their captors. But no state was willing to send in their forces to do such a task. So what was their responsibility in the end for the consequences? Well, MSF did reflect. I was working at the time with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, as it's known in America. And we reflected on these issues a lot. And after the emergency situation was stabilised, and then you really have time to reflect, because at the beginning it's very difficult when you're trying to save as many lives as possible, and thought, well, you know, to say it's unacceptable means it's unacceptable, and to say it's unacceptable means we won't accept it. So if the international community, if the states who are responsible for protecting refugees are unwilling to act in this case, then it leaves us in a completely untenable position. Should we continue to assist in something that is so overtly wrong, or should we say, no, we invoke an ethic of refusal, we refuse to do so, and we leave the camps? And that was a decision that we made at the time. And I was the head of MSF in the camps when that decision was made in with Paris. It was very acrimonious, the debate that occurred, not just within the aid community, but within MSF sections themselves, because in the end, the MSF France operation ceased, but MSF Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and Spain continued. So it was a very difficult debate within the movement itself. But, and that's what provoked this question in the book that I wrote. What is the responsibility? How can we say that it's better not to aid a population than to participate in something that is so wrong? And so these questions we see over and over again in humanitarian action. How to reach the victims without strengthening their oppressors. We see it in Darfur today. We see it in so many cases where there is a population in need, but in order to help that population, you have to sup with the devil. You have to shake hands with, negotiate with, you have to legitimize, you have to somehow deal with the people who are in charge of causing the suffering. And this creates enormous ethical questions for the humanitarian aid organisations having to address this. So for MSF, and I think what I've tried to push many times is we need to draw a bottom line. Because I think since the Rwandan refugee crisis, there has been a lot more thought given to some of these ethical issues. It's no longer that they're just swept under the carpet. There is at least, you know, discussion on them. And I think as long as there is discussion, aid organisations are free to make different judgments, because it is a real dilemma. There is no right and wrong answer, and every organisation has to, according to its mandate, its set of priorities, its activities, has to make a decision accordingly. But then, once they've made that decision, should be able to live with the consequences of their actions, I think. And for MSF, the real bottom line is that when aid is turned against the people it is intended to assist, then that should be the bottom line, where you say, well, it's better to stop than to continue. So, of course, how do you judge when aid is being turned against the people it is intended to assist? Well, I think when the balance becomes too much on the favour of strengthening the people in charge of the oppression and for the benefit, and not freeing them in some way or making them a further target of the power of the people who are oppressing them. So after the Rwandan refugee crisis, there were efforts, as I said, to improve the accountability. This was a word thrown around a lot in the aid community, accountability of aid organisations. Accountability to whom? Or to donors, to the general public who was funding these operations. Accountability to the refugees and the victims themselves. It's very difficult to try to unravel some of these issues, and how do you enforce accountability? So aid organisations got together and said what we need is there was already existing a code of conduct, but this needs to be strengthened. We need to, all sign on to a pledge that we will act in a certain way and look at certain issues. And this code of conduct was quite useful in at least trying to get all the aid organisations, and it's a very disparate bunch, some with great, huge budgets and a large experience of working in emergencies, some with very small budgets who are brand new at doing so, trying to get everybody across the board, at least on the same wavelength, that these are the issues we need to be looking at. And whilst it was very good from that perspective, unfortunately this code of conduct was proved very quickly in the case of North Korea to be, well, at best a fig leaf. Something to show to the donors, look, we are being ethically responsible, but actually not doing very much for the victims at all. I don't know how familiar you are with the situation in North Korea, but it was only really a few years later that the massive famine was declared in North Korea, and the international community mounted one of the biggest aid operations ever. And, but the way the North Korean regime is, it did not allow aid organisations to have any access or to be able to carry out an independent needs assessment to say, well, these are the people that need the aid and these people are okay. It didn't allow aid organisations to have any control over the aid coming in. Everything had to be controlled by the regime. And it didn't allow any monitoring or evaluation of the aid effort. So it was impossible, basically, to know if the food was going to the people who really needed it. And again, MSF tried very hard to work inside the country, but soon discovered that inside its therapeutic and supplementary feeding centres, knowing that there was starvation going on, none of the children were malnourished. And yet it would see, as it was working or driving along the roads, very heavily guarded by the North Koreans, they would see children in rags, children who were picking up rice grains from between the railway tracks. And they would say to their minders, but who is this child? Why can't they come to the feeding centre? And the minder would say, what child? What child? There is no such child. And in the feeding centre, there was no malnutrition. The children they were feeding were quite well fed. So although knowing that there was a famine going on, and still we don't know how many people died during that period. One day when the veil is lifted on North Korea, I certainly hope I'm wrong, that there were not millions of deaths that could have been prevented. But I fear the worst, because afterwards going up on the North Korean-Chinese border and talking with refugees and who had never seen foreigners before, who had never heard of food aid, or those that had carried it to a military warehouse and exacerbated the flood damage before a UN mission occurred. And yet, year after year, the aid organisations working in North Korea would say, no, we are reaching the most vulnerable, we are reaching those in most need, and we have signed on every year to the code of conduct that shows that we are being responsible. And yet, in my mind, they were being more than irresponsible, because at the end of the day, the people who really needed the food most were not those who were receiving it. The people that were receiving the food were those deemed to be worthy of living by the North Korean regime, and those deemed expendable probably died. And let's just hope I'm wrong on that, but I think the evidence we collected at the time showed that, that it was really a devastating famine going on. So what to do? Well, there is certainly a lot more need for truth-telling, for a start, within the humanitarian community, and within the wider political community, because it's very interesting, and we can talk about this afterwards if anybody is interested in talking about Darfur today, and to talk about the difference between the media reports and the reports about what is going on, and some of the perceptions of aid organisations and those of us working on the ground see in the situation in Darfur. I think a very honest assessment of what is possible, what is the political ramifications, what is the political context, who is actually benefiting from the aid that is coming in, who are the winners and who are the losers, because we find there are some in every aid operation. But I think what I've seen at Duke so far is quite inspiring, to see that at least there is, on the forefront, some ethical discussion going on which transgresses all these different disciplines, to actually see that this is a very interesting topic for people to engage in. Because unfortunately, I think in the aid community, there is not a lot of this discussion. People tend to get swept up on their need to always project a very positive image that aid necessarily is saving lives, because there is the tension between acting and having the money from the general public that is needed in order to act, and actually, they get caught up in their own propaganda, I think, sometimes. Nobody wants to admit that sometimes there are big problems, there are very difficult dilemmas, there are no right and wrong answers to a lot of these questions, and you really need to, I think, be honest with the people donating the money, and to be much more open and have these kind of discussions coming much more to the forefront, and not necessarily in a judgmental fashion. I think that some aid organisations will decide different ways to react. Some will decide, yes, it is better to leave. But even if one organisation leaves and is able to put a lot more pressure to bear on the state by saying this is unacceptable, which is what happened when MSF left the Rwandan refugee camps. Suddenly, by this organisation leaving, it put a lot more attention on the problems. Of course, they weren't resolved, but at least at a very local level in the camps, the refugee leaders realized that they had to curb their own excesses, and they had to try to stop some of the worst abuses going on, or else all the aid organisations might leave, and that would have left them in a terrible situation because they really needed to be living with the refugees in order to be able to be sustainable as a fighting force.
There's a lot on people's minds in these areas, and they run from the philosophical to the practical, and just start the engagement back and forth right now and see where it would take. And so the floor is open for questions, comments, issues. If you can come to the mic, that would be great. And we have a mic, there's a mic on the second floor as well. I think if you're on the third floor, you have to come down one.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, I'm Steve Hoff, and thank you from the community. Thank you for your talk and being here, and I think we're all very fortunate for that. And the question is about at the post-genocide in Rwanda, the refugee camps were the perpetrators of that genocide, the Hutus primarily, and it's kind of, to me, it's kind of, I'm sure to others also, it's kind of mind-boggling to be giving service, providing aid, providing comfort to the perpetrators of a very horrific, human rights crime, mass murder, and how that, the paradox of that is very profound, and just to comment on how aid agencies, work that fence line.
Okay, well, it's a good question but I think not all the people that were in the Rwandan refugee camps were responsible for genocide, and it's very difficult for aid organisations to play the role of judge. How could we know who was responsible for genocide and who was not, who deserved humanitarian aid and who did not? That's really beyond the role of humanitarian aid organisations. There were women, there were children in the camps, there were, people who genuinely needed humanitarian assistance. So that's where it becomes very difficult, because aid organisations are not equipped with the knowledge necessary to be able to make judgments on who has done what in the past. I think at some point aid organisations really felt a very strong discomfort in wondering how many of the people working for them had actually been active in the genocide. And at some point there was a really big push for aid organisations to start screening their list of employees a bit better. But then again, it's very easy to accuse somebody of genocide who maybe had not committed genocide. And who were the aid organisations? They were not really in a position to judge. So that's why the debate was very difficult at that time. That's why in MSF we faced very bad criticism about, how can you leave? How can you abandon this population of refugees who really need your assistance? And I have to say, we would have been in a terrible position had there been suddenly a cholera epidemic that had broken out just after we left the camps. That adds a real dimension of, ethical responsibility to the equation. Thank goodness it didn't happen, because I'm not sure I could be standing here today in front of you talking about it if it had. But that's why these decisions are so difficult to make, about whether to stay, whether to leave. And a lot of people said to me, you took the easy option. It's so much easier to leave. And I said, no way. You cannot say that unless you've ever left, and I can tell you it's much harder to leave. It's much harder to go against the flow. It's much harder to go against the very strong emotions that humanitarian need can invoke in people. How can you abandon these women and children to their fate? It was a very powerful argument on their side.
So, question here, can you come to the microphone right there in the middle, on the second floor?
Hello. I'm studying public policy here at Stanford School, and I'm a Rotary Peace Fellow. And I would like to thank you, Terry, for sharing your great story with us. And I happen to come from South Korea, and I'm getting a newsletter from a South Korean NGO about North Korean refugee. situation. So I'd like to share a story. I completely understand your concerns that the most needed are might not be reached by international aid. But actually, the international aid, thankfully, reaching maybe they are reaching only for the privileged people, but because of this foreign aid, the market, even though it's gray market, it's shaded undercover black market, still people are selling and buying some corn and rice. And because of the international aid, rumor can make a lot of effect on the market. And the market price of corn and rice falls down only because of the rumor, and sometimes when the real rice comes from US or South Korea, that really affects the undershaded markets as well. So actually, by one, I forgot the expression in English, the trickling effect, that really happened in North Korea, and that is why some NGOs are still arguing for more international aid from donor countries. Otherwise, people are really dying there still now. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I'm very glad to hear that's the case. And perhaps it is the case now. I think in 1998, 1999, it was much more difficult. Certainly the North Koreans that I interviewed coming across into China had really never seen aid and had talked about terrible starvation and massive death within their communities. So if it's trickling down now, that's great. But still that doesn't resolve my problem of truth-telling within the aid community. Flooding a country with food aid as a solution to famine is not in itself a problem. This is what we tried to do in Somalia during the 1991-92 famine. Because of the theft of food aid, which was so enormous, the only way to resolve it was to just try and flood the country, reduce the price of aid, of wheat, etc., so that the people it would eventually trickle down to those who were not receiving it directly. But let's be honest about that. Let's not pretend that we are really feeding in feeding centres starving children only when the cameras are on them, and let's not pretend to sign on to a code of conduct where point number one is we will conduct an independent evaluation of the needs of North Korea. Not possible. Let's admit it. Let's kill the pretense. Let's have an open discussion on aid to North Korea and on who is giving the aid and for what reason. I think South Korea has very good political reasons to give aid to North Korea, as does Japan, as does the United States. But let's not call it humanitarian aid. Let's call it political aid. Let's call it what it is.
I know it's crowded down here, so I'm going to pass the mic around on the first floor.
Hi, my name is James Pierce. I'm a first-year law student, and actually, for the past year and a half, I was working with the United Nations Development Program in West Darfur, in Sudan, where you are. So have faced a number of these issues. Would be interested to hear your take, since you're now in Sudan and have been, in terms of what you think will happen there. But I actually have a more specific question as to what you've talked about. In terms of recommendations for improving the awareness of the humanitarian community, you've stressed truth-telling, and as you well know, MSF has a reputation within the community of being one of the few that will tell the truth and either leave or get kicked out of countries. I wonder if you feel that, to a certain extent, you work with the ICRC at the moment, is that right? International Commission on the Red Cross. That organization has a very different reputation, one of being very quiet and being very neutral. I wonder if you feel what would allow the truth-telling would be those kinds of organizations that are very careful not to come out on one side or another. In other words, does an MSF approach need an ICRC to be effective? I mean, do you need to have organizations that will continue to be there, that will hold themselves out as non-political, impartial, as much as a fiction as this may be, for that to actually be effective? Or do you actually see something where widespread truth-telling throughout the various organizations with their different mandates and agendas? Thank you.
Okay, well, can I address the second part first? Firstly, I must say that, clarification, I'm working as an independent consultant on a project for ICRC, because if I was working with ICRC, you are quite right, I wouldn't even be allowed to be here speaking. So, important distinction. Yes, the ICRC has a reputation of confidentiality, which then ensures that it is able to have a dialogue with the authorities. And so it's been a very interesting experience for me to go from MSF, which, as you say, often speaks out publicly about what goes on, to the ICRC, which doesn't say anything publicly. But that doesn't mean it doesn't say anything, and that doesn't mean it doesn't tell the truth. The difference is that it tells the truth to the authorities concerned. You just don't hear about it because these dialogues remain confidential. And in fact, it's really incredible what is able to be said to the people, you know, who are responsible for certain acts, and this dialogue is ongoing because the ICRC doesn't go public on this type of thing. So yes, you're right, there is a need for both types of organisation. And I would say, though, truth-telling needs to be across the board. It doesn't necessarily need to be public. It doesn't necessarily need to be shouting from the rooftops about the injustice or this and that. But there needs to be far more honesty, even just within the humanitarian community, just around the table. Let's talk about these real issues, and let's not try to cover up or to just deny it's happening, you know, which is what happened with North Korea. I was engaged in a roundtable discussion with organisations who were there. And there was just statistic after statistic being pulled out in these meetings. Statistics which are meaningless when we don't even know what the base population of North Korea is within, 2 million. So it was just a way of not addressing the real issues by, arguing on a technical basis or arguing on a statistical basis. So I think more honesty there is needed. As for Darfur today, it's getting more complicated. Perhaps the level of violence has diminished. The number of internally displaced persons has increased. The mortality has perhaps gone down. But a lot of the different groups are factionalizing. It's definitely becoming more complicated. And the fact that President Bashir has now been indicted by the International Criminal Court is likely to complicate the situation further, because I think you will not be hearing very much from aid organisations on the ground. I don't think they will be able anymore to go out and interview victims who have had their villages burnt, etc., without facing potential accusations that they are collecting evidence for the International Criminal Court. So it's a very interesting debate, one that we should all follow very closely, this decision of the International Criminal Court to indict General Bashir, and what it's going to mean for the peace processes in the south and in Darfur, whether it's going to, this whole debate over justice versus peace. What should we have in Sudan? And I have my own views on it, but it will be an interesting debate to follow in the future. Already the UN is so afraid of what's going to happen that all families from the UN have been evacuated from Khartoum. So troubled times are expected ahead.
Good. Peter and Wayne, and then up here and back down here. Go ahead.
My name is Josh Laxina. I'm a student in the MD PhD program. Hi. My question was, when you face this difficult decision of whether to continue aid or to stop it, what are the specific metrics that you use to set the threshold as to whether you will continue or stop aid? How do you set the specific conditions that say, beyond this point, we will go no further?
Okay, well, the point, I think, should be that, as I mentioned earlier, when the aid is thought to be used by the oppressors against their victims, when it's really it's counterproductive. And I mean, how do you judge that? It's very difficult. But there are a few basic parameters we need to always bear in mind. If you are not able to conduct an independent evaluation of who is in need in a place, that starts ringing the alarm bells. It means that somebody is trying to direct your aid effort towards one group perhaps over another, or people don't trust you, or, there is already a problem if that is not possible. And then if you're not able to control the aid coming in, that also is obviously going to be a major problem. If you're not able to monitor the aid, either after a food distribution by going and doing what we call a food basket monitoring survey, looking in at the food ration that not everybody, but every 20th person has received, and then being able to evaluate the impact of your aid in a global sense. If you're not able to do those 4 things, already that's going to pose a problem. And it's, within that, there are times when, okay, you're not able to do an independent evaluation. That doesn't mean you pull out. It just means, okay, alarm bells should be ringing. You're always having to make compromises, always, in the humanitarian scene. But you have to look at each individual thing and just keep a very clear-headed analysis. There will always be winners and always be losers. But as long as the people who are gaining from the aid are not then using it against the refugees or the victims themselves, then I think you have to accept quite a lot of compromise. I mean, to give you an example, in Somalia back in the 1991 famine, we were using armed escort at that stage. We were all delivering aid over a barrel of a gun, and we had to hire 2 different clans, because if you only hired one clan to escort your food convoy, there was a possibility that that very clan would take off with it. So you would have to hire an opposing clan to have this sort of rapport de force in amongst, for every food distribution you were doing. This raises huge ethical questions in itself. What happens if they ran into bandits and started to kill them all? What's your responsibility for that whenever you use armed escort? This is a question you have to address, whether it's a peacekeeper or a bandit or a rebel faction, whoever. And so then you think of the cost and the whole protection racket you have started. Once you start using armed escort, it's very difficult to get out of it because it's a very lucrative business. You're paying the service of armed men and to protect your relief convoy. You can't one day then say to them, hey, we don't need you anymore. They'll say, well, yes, you do. You wait till you go out again. You'll see that you need us. So it's absolutely impossible to get out of this spiral once you've started. And then you look at how much money you are actually providing into the hands of the warlords. So when you look at all of that in Somalia back in 91, 92, you would surely say no. But I wouldn't say that. I would say that in spite of all that, the magnitude of the problem was such that we would probably do it all again because there were so many people dying a day. And so whatever decision you make about the possibilities of delivering that aid, it has to be taken into account vis-a-vis the magnitude of the problem.
So if I may switch the direction of the conversation for a second. We're sending hundreds of our students to work in these kind of experiences, although not in these deeply both dangerous and probably the most deeply paradoxical as well. And you've been working in the field for many years. And I think it's a very important question for us to understand how we, within the context of what we can do, best prepare our students from the standpoint of someone who then will be receiving these students and working with them and engaging them in these kind of enterprises. So it's important for us to hear from you, I think, how you see these students and what you think we should be doing to best prepare them, given that these situations will always have these paradoxes, perhaps not at the same depth that you've described, but they always have these paradoxes. And there's always this sense of learning how to make trade-offs in ethically complicated situations.
Well, I think it's very important to try and keep a balance between making them aware that there are these negative effects so they can really, because if we don't do that, then people can become very disillusioned. The ungrateful refugee is one of the hardest things to cope with when you first start in the aid world. You just can't imagine that here you are. The self-sacrifice of our aid workers is something phenomenal. They think, I'm just here to help you, and you're so ungrateful. And that can turn into a real bitterness afterwards. So I think already if people realise that and are really aware of this fact that there is, a real potential negative effect of your assistance, then that already would be a major achievement. But then not feed them with so much that then they lose the motivation to go. Because funnily enough, the whole do no harm slogan that came out by Mary Anderson and others after the Rwandan camps and this whole efforts at codes of conduct and everything has had in itself a perverse effect. That sometimes aid organisations are so worried about the potential negative effects of their aid that they end up being completely frozen. And they end up doing things, as we can see in Darfur today, which are really counterproductive to the whole reason they're there. To give you an example, in the camps, the displaced camps, the level of aid is quite high. There are education programs going on. There is even something called child-friendly spaces set up in these camps. Now, in the context of Darfur, where people didn't even have access to education or clean water before, suddenly are introducing a very high level of service compared to what they have before. So there are a lot of questions we can ask about that. What's the appropriate response in terms of how much aid should be given? And then, of course, the camps become a draw card, and people start to move to the camps. And suddenly the aid organisations are realising that, you know, the solution to the problem does not lie with people living in camps. It lies with people going back home again. But the longer you stay in a displaced or refugee camp, the more difficult it is to go home. Other people have taken over your land, they're farming it, there is a whole, you know, other dynamic going on. So now they're having a reaction, oh, we must do no harm, and they've absolutely stopped registering new IDPs. They're calling everybody economic migrants, or making the registration process very difficult. So people have to really be able to prove that they fled conflict and are not just economic migrants. But this in itself is something terrible. There still are, you know, terrible things going on. There still are people who are fleeing for their lives, and there are people who are just fleeing for a better life. Who wouldn't want education that is offered in the camp for their kids when they've been nomads and have finally decided to settle down? So this is one of the difficult things to try to project. How do you do no, well, and that's why I'm not a fan of do no harm, because for me, it's misleading. It's impossible to do no harm. So let's, for a start, not go by that slogan, which you will hear all the time in the aid world, do no harm, do no harm. We can't, it's impossible. So let's cut through that, and they'll say, okay, let's have a hard-headed look of the things we need to look out for, the potential areas where we may do more harm than good or may cause some perverse effects.
We got Wayne, and then here and here.
Hi, I'm Wayne Norman from Kenan and from the Department of Philosophy. I'm very intrigued by the many discussions and debates behind closed doors that you had either in site or back at head office as you were deliberating about new policies and new ways to confront the paradoxes. And so there were two questions I wanted to ask you, or two related aspects of those conversations I wouldn't mind hearing more about. One is, you've generally talked about kind of two options. Either you stay and you keep doing what you can, or you get out. And there was a third option mentioned, that you bring in a kind of international police force that you sort of assumed was just unfeasible. And so I'm wondering whether a lot of the debate involved people trying to advance other kinds of options somewhere between staying and pulling out, and whether there was any progress in that way. The other thing, as a philosopher, that I'm interested in is whether, upon sort of retrospectively, upon reflection, you saw those debates as people largely using kind of the same ethical principles, that is, how can we save as many people as possible? And then just disagreeing about the means and what the consequences and perverse and unseen perverse consequences were on the one hand, versus some people saying, look, even if we can save more people, we cannot do this because it's just, you know, unacceptable to deal with people who've committed genocide, or unacceptable to deal with a totalitarian regime in that way, or that. What, in other words, was there a clash of values, or were there really just disagreements about consequences and effects?
Okay, so to your last question first, I think that there was a real both. I mean, there were so many diverse opinions, and it's not that you can't deal with a totalitarian regime. We had to deal with a totalitarian regime. The problem in the camps was that definitely the fact that they had committed genocide was a factor. I mean, the crime of crimes definitely upped the ante in terms of who were the people benefiting, and the fact that they had an ideology of wanting to reconquer Rwanda and finish the genocide that they had started, and that they were killing people in the camps that wanted to go home, that they were launching attacks into Rwanda to kill genocide survivors who would potentially testify against them in the Arusha tribunal and the internal courts that happened afterwards. So, you know, that was a real problem. But yeah, so it was a question of what are going to be the consequences? A lot of people could say, well, we cannot predict the long-term consequences of these camps, but if we withdraw our services, we can predict that it's going to be, this was Oxfam's point of view in arguments I had with them, we can predict that if we stop our water supply in the camps, people are going to die like flies, versus an unknown future. And I think, okay, fair point. But I think also sometimes aid organisations overestimate their own importance in the survival of people. Because in fact, when the camps were attacked and the refugees were all pushed back en masse, the mortality among them was very, very low. So sometimes we cut out a niche for ourselves, which is too important. So I think that needs to be considered as well in the equation of, are we indispensable to the survival of these people or not? And as it turns out, we weren't. What are going to be the consequences? We can't predict them, but we had a pretty good idea. Paul Kagame, 6 months before he attacked the camps, warned the international community this is what he would do. So, you know, you can't say we didn't know. So I think that was, there were both sides in it. There was certainly that debate going on. And to your first question, I'm sorry.
What kind of an alternative really was there?
Yeah. Okay, there were different degrees of options between staying and going. And there were some really good initiatives in the camps by the aid organisations. They called it the résistance humanitaire, to try to curb the abuse of the leaders, to try to, for instance, go around the leaders who were responsible for giving out the food and instead appoint women as representatives, so that the food would, you know, not be used to control the refugees as much. At the beginning, all salaries were paid in US dollars, which was just crazy. So that was changed to Zairian currency, so it wouldn't have such value on the arms market, etc. So, I mean, there were different initiatives. Speaking out continually because a lot of people said, but MSF, if you go, you have no legitimacy anymore to talk about the situation, which frankly I don't agree with, but there is a point there. You have much more legitimacy when you are there, when you are documenting, when you are talking about the problems. But everybody had tried. We knew there was not going to be any help from a military intervention of any kind to separate the people responsible for genocide for the others. And by this time anyway, they'd all taken off their uniforms, of course, and blended in with the population. It was very hard to identify them. So in the end, they were just cosmetic changes because the fundamental issue remained that the people were never separated. They were controlling the refugees. The Rwandan government had a legitimate fear of these refugee camps on its borders and decided to attack them. And I think, as a consequence, the humanitarian aid organisations do bear a certain amount, not primary responsibility, of course, that lies with the people who did the attacking, not even secondary responsibility, because that lies with the states that had the capacity to do something and did nothing. It's really a much lower order responsibility, but nevertheless, it is a responsibility.
Here, we've got a question here, here, and then up here.
Thank you. I have a question about a somewhat different paradox. And and I want to make it clear, I'm not asking to cast blame, but I want to ask about the Palestinian refugees who have been in refugee camps for 60 years. That's 3 generations for them. And having them have to live entirely on aid allows them to live like that without having any kind of a normal life, any sort of an economy, and basically it keeps them in prison for generation after generation. And do you have anything to say about that?
Let them all go home? I mean, no, I mean, it's a terrible situation. They were, in fact, the first sort of refugee warriors identified. No, I mean, it's a tragic situation, but it needs a political resolution, not a humanitarian one. So, you know, that really belongs in the political realm, that question, and which must be separated, I think, from the humanitarian realm. Humanitarian organisations need to realise what their limits are and not go beyond these, not into the political realm, I think.
My name is Abdullah Antepli, Muslim chaplain here at Duke. My question is on a different issue. In this code of conduct that you mentioned, that aid organizations agree, is there anything against religious proselytization? My Turkish accent.
Yes, yeah.
Because I don't think the potential harm of the aid organizations is not limited to only feeling the violence or not delivering to the most needy. And I think this honoring local belief, the practices, all the cultures of these people, or manipulating their vulnerable situation and by delivering aid, sort of trying to change their religion or their way of living, and social implications afterwards is also another potential way of harm. Could you say more about that?
Yes, I think you're totally right. And I think any organisation that uses their aid in furthering a religious cause is not a humanitarian organisation, because by definition, humanitarian aid has to be given only on the basis of who is in need, no other basis whatsoever, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whatever. It shouldn't be in consideration. So those organisations that are benefiting certain groups over others are not humanitarian organisations. And then there is a certain danger, obviously, of trying to push a religious agenda on a population, which we've seen a lot of in the past. I would say it's probably a little less now, although there are NGOs today distributing Bibles in Darfur. And I would say to them, you're mad, because I think it's a very dangerous activity to do. But it certainly still does occur, but I think to a lesser extent. Yeah, I would say less than in the 80s, yes.
As far as withdrawing from refugee camps goes, isn't that the same as sacrificing lives right now to save lives in the future? How do you balance, potential suffering with suffering that's going on right now? How do you determine that balance?
Well, I think it's very difficult to. I think that if, for instance, if leaving a refugee situation, I think if MSF had considered that there was going to be a large loss of life because it had left the Rwandan refugee camps, then it would not have done so. All of these decisions, I think, are made once the acute emergency situation is over, because the first priority is to save lives. And it's after that, then you have to look at some of the issues about long-term consequences and what are we responsible for. But at the beginning of an emergency situation, you're honestly so busy trying, and this was part of the problem in the Rwandan camps, in fact, because we were following the textbook notion of refugees and how to take care of them. Something like 250,000 refugees flooded across the border into Tanzania within a matter of days. So simply the logistical effort to try to save lives, to get clean drinking water, to get food in, to get shelter, was enormous. So people tried to keep the groups of refugees together in their village, in their community, with their community leaders, just like it would say in the refugee textbooks you should do. However, it was a very unusual situation where those were the people who were actually controlling the refugees and forcing them out of Rwanda. So I think that these considerations definitely have to be taken into account, but once the acute emergency situation is over. And it's always hard to predict what the future consequences are going to be, but that's what drove me in my book to try to analyse situations from the past. I looked at the Rwandan refugee situation, but I looked at, where were the lessons from the past? I looked at the Khmer Rouge in Thailand, I looked at the Nicaraguan and Salvadoran camps in Honduras, and the Afghan camps in Pakistan to say we should have learned the lessons of the past. We cannot ignore the consequences. It's not good enough just to say that what we are doing is good. We have to take into account also what the consequences might be.
My name is Merve. I'm in public policy program. I would like you to speak about another aspect of the paradox of humanitarian action, mainly the potential of humanitarian aid of corrupting the mentality of people in a way that they expect all the time getting things for free, especially in non-conflict situations when they know even if they don't plow their land and they have drought or something, they will anyways get free food or free medical services. So what's your experience and opinion about that?
My experience is that I've rarely met a refugee population or a displaced population who wouldn't prefer to go home if they had the security to do so. So I think, I'm not sure in Darfur how it's going to play out, but it's very rare, especially for refugees who are in a neighbouring country or in a third country, not to want to go home and not to prefer to take the risks and the lack of aid and go home rather than staying where they are. So I think the whole sort of dependence on aid argument has been overemphasised in the past. It's certainly not the experience that I've seen with regard to refugees. Does that answer your question? Yeah. For conflict situations, yeah. Well, I don't work in development, so it's more difficult for me to comment on developmental situations.
Got here, one up here, and then if there are any final, got a couple final questions here.
I'm Robin Kirk, the director of the Human Rights Center here. It's down here, sorry.
Where am I looking at? Sorry.
You're lost. I know you've been traveling a lot, so you may not have noticed that we're in the middle of electing a new president.
Could anyone not notice?
Right. And if I understand it correctly, the United States government is the largest governmental donor of humanitarian aid in the world. If you had 3 wishes for how the United States should change or reform its humanitarian aid policy at this point, what would they be?
Put me in charge. I think that what I would love to see is that there is less ambiguity over what is humanitarian aid and what is aid that is pursuing the foreign policy interests of the US government. And there's nothing wrong with that. We can use food to do such a thing, but let's not have the pretense of calling it humanitarian. Humanitarian needs to be given, purely on the basis of need, and not on the basis of what are the foreign policy goals of a government. So that would be my first wish. Whew. That would already be really great if that happened. Yes, I'm a bit, and perhaps also, to allow NGOs to be really NGOs, but that's a two-sided thing. It's really astounding in the field to see how close American NGOs are to the government. It's something unique, it seems to me, to American NGOs, and it's nothing new because all through the Cold War it was the same, that there is a very, very close relationship, so that the whole in the non-government organisation part is really a fallacy. And I think it's very important for the rest of the aid community that American NGOs and the United States government come to some agreement that some independence would be really great. Because when there is an NGO who is carrying out purely the politics of the government, it is really, it's known pretty much in the field. And it actually has an effect for all the NGOs because we are, to a large extent, all painted with the same brush. And so what is true for one, the perceptions are everything that counts. And there are many NGOs out there that really look like they are pursuing a political agenda and not the humanitarian action that we should all be about. So I think some kind of mutual respect and understanding, because Colin Powell came up with a wonderful speech in asking NGOs to be part of the combat team. It was very open, very overt, called all the NGOs together, we're all working for the same values. Well, okay, but those values are the ones that are today being questioned by the Taliban, being questioned by Al-Qaeda. If you really want to be effective as a humanitarian aid worker, you have to disassociate yourself with that. And this is becoming more and more difficult for NGOs. This is why we are seeing more and more casualties in places like Afghanistan. In the past, we were not targeted necessarily because we were representing the Christian Western world. We were maybe targeted because of something we had done or some perception or just an accident. But now we're really seeing in Afghanistan and elsewhere that people are being targeted because of what they represent. That when we have such a clash between what the Taliban want in Afghanistan from what the aid community is trying to construct in Afghanistan, when there is no common basis of values practically at all, I think we're headed into pretty difficult waters ahead in countries like Afghanistan, where the very sort of stability and not peace. I don't think peace is a humanitarian, we shouldn't be aiming for that, but at least to really help people to establish them in their livelihoods. It goes against this for an organisation that wants chaos, it goes against their very agenda. And so I think we're going to face much more clashes now in the field between aid workers who are very much seen to represent the Western interests and Christian interests and others.
I know this isn't as much of a humanitarian question, but concerning, you have a lot of experience with the Rwandan camps, so I was just wondering your personal opinion on General Nkunda in DRC and his claims of the validity of his claims of protecting the Tutsi minority there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've been in Myanmar for the last 3 years and then Sudan, so my focus has changed quite a lot. I haven't been following the DRC at all. I'm sorry.
Well, okay. Never mind.
Sorry.
Did you have a question? Got a question here, and we have time for one more after this if there's...
Hi, I'm Phil Costanzo in the Department of Psychology and part of the Kenan Institute as well. I'm curious about, through your experiences, how your motivations have changed and how your definition of what is good has changed. It seems to be, these experiences seem to be rather sobering, and the sort of, just the as good and evil come closer together in a way. It sort of has an impact on how you philosophically think about what you're doing in humanitarian aid and could lead to a lot of cynicism. So I'm sort of concerned about how you've weathered this and how your definitions of being good, being humanistic, have changed over time.
Well, I no longer want to be Secretary General of the United Nations. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm still there. I'm still carrying it out. I'm living in Sudan, so the motivation is still there. And every time I do feel jaded, I really only need to look around me. Living in Khartoum is enough. You don't even need to go to Darfur to see, you know, the difference in what we have and what the people around have, and that there are people suffering everywhere. And that's enough motivation to continue to try. But I've always been driven by a sense of anger as well, rather than pity. And I think that that's very important. I've always been driven by a sense of injustice and, you know, a sense of, well, why was I born to who I was born to? Why am I privileged? And why was I not born to a Darfuri family? So it's that sense of injustice. I have to say now I'm a bit more confused over justice and peace, having, as I invoked before, what should take priority is now a very interesting new thought process for me to try to pick through some of these issues. But I think trying to wake up the aid community has been interesting experience. You have to be very thick-skinned, and I haven't always worn that very well. I have to say that the acrimony that is out there when you actually challenge the status quo, it's hard sometimes to wear, to be really disliked for actually trying to push people to reflect on what they're doing, particularly over North Korea, took its toll a bit. But overall, my motivation hasn't really changed because, you know, it only takes going to one of these places to realize and remember what you are trying to achieve.
Fiona, thank you. I just want to thank Fiona. We're in your debt for coming here and for your engagement with all of us in these remarks. I'm going to remember a couple of things. I'm going to remember truth-telling. We can all use a little remembrance of that. I'm going to remember anger and not pity. And I think especially this notion about you can't do no harm. That I think all of us who are engaged in different ways, it's easy in an ethics institute to think that you can work it out perfectly. And the notion that you can't and that you have to get on with it like that is, I think, helpful to all of us, and to Eric and all the students who are sending out in Duke Engage and otherwise. That's a useful thing to bring with them to begin with. So we thank you. We're in your debt. I have two brief announcements. One is that for those of you who are still interested in even more focus on ethics, next Thursday at 5:30, right here in Fleischmann Commons, the Sanford Institute is hosting its annual Crown Lecture in Ethics, and Julian Savulesco, who is a bioethicist from Oxford and the head of their ethics center, will give a talk entitled "The Moral Imperative to Enhance Human Beings." It promises to be a firework kind of time, and I want to commend and welcome all of you to that as well. And then just before you depart, right upstairs here on the main floor entrance, there is a reception for all of us, and those of you who wish to corner Fiona, that's a good time to do it. Again, thank you.